Hello, everyone, once again, and thank you very much for joining us. So today we have an interesting mix of audience. So on the one hand, we have students who are based in Portugal, and then also an international audience. And we are here to discuss with Ambassador Kishan Rana his latest work, his latest book. Called Churchill and India, Manipulation or Betrayal, recently published with Routledge. As we all know, Ambassador Rana is someone with quite an impressive process and history. Someone who currently is Professor Emeritus at Diplo Foundation and an honorary fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi, and someone who has a very long diplomatic experience, both as an ambassador and in other positions in several countries throughout his career. It is a great pleasure to have you here with us today, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are going to organize this session with a first part in which Ambassador Rana will talk about his book. We'll talk about his book and the ideas behind the book and the motivations for the book. And then we'll have a second moment in which I will place some questions related to the book, and we'll have a brief chat about that, and then we'll open the floor to the rest of the audience. So thank you very much once again, and please feel free. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Well, this book started as a project when I visited Churchill College, Churchill Archives for the first time in 1999, and it seemed interesting that while some 2,000 plus books have been written on the life and story and the achievements of Winston Churchill, nobody had written a complete panoramic examination. Nobody had undertaken such an examination of Churchill's India connection. And the more one read about it, the more it became clear that this was a particularly interesting and somewhat dark spot on his career. Let me plunge straight into the structure of my book. Churchill spent 3 years in India between 1896 and 99, when he was a young officer, just recruited into the 4th Hussars, which was a cavalry regiment, which was sent to India on rotation as British regiments were sent. Now, the organization of the Indian Army was a little bit unusual in that the British regiments and the Indian regiments were all officered by British personnel. These two kinds of regiments never mixed. They never fraternized. They did not play games together. They did not undertake war exercises together. So they lived in hermetically sealed spheres, and yet they were part of what was called the Indian Army run by the British in India. Now, those 3 years that Churchill spent in India were a time for Churchill for self-study. Remember, he had never been to university, and he used the spare time available in the life of a British Army officer for intensive study of books of the great classics, Gibbons and Macaulay, and a number of major works which he had not read, which he knew were central to understanding the history of the West, the history of Britain in particular. And of course, he was guided by the books that had been recommended by his father, the late Lord Randolph Churchill, whom he worshipped, literally worshipped, and at the same time had an extremely complex relationship with. This was also the time when Churchill took part in military adventure. He joined 2 campaigns on the Afghan frontier, the frontier of India and Afghanistan, British India and Afghanistan. And in the very first one, he saw warfare in all its brutality for a period of several weeks. This was also the time when Churchill, in a sense, framed his entire life project, what he wanted to do in the future. And he wrote a very fine essay on rhetoric, as he called it, which set out the way in which he would conduct himself in politics, his manner of speaking, his lines of argument, etc. And this was also the time when Churchill engaged in the game of polo very intensively and built connections with Indian princely families and the aristocracy of India, you could say. But what he absolutely did not do was he did not make any attempt to talk to anybody who was knowledgeable about the country or to understand India. So, in a sense, those 3 years produced a kind of caricature of India in his mind, in his imagination. And this remained with him for his entire life, in a way. At one point in 1929, Lord Irwin, who was Viceroy, said that there are some interesting Indians who are traveling to Britain, and I would like them to meet you and update you in your knowledge of India. And Churchill said, I'm perfectly comfortable in all that I know about India, and I do not want my mind muddled by any bloody Indians. I mean, these were the words he used, actually. So Churchill's India connection divides into 3 broad phases. The period from 1896, when he landed in India, till about 1921, when there was, you could say, an inflection point in his perspective, and he decided that an India which was on a slow, glacially moving path towards self-government since 1906, that self-governance for India, even in tiny steps, was not acceptable, because India was the jewel of the British crown, and at a time when war was likely, tensions were rising in Europe, Britain needed an India which it could essentially use as its prime resource. He said this in so many words in a number of speeches that he delivered between 1929 and 1935, when he opposed what was called the Government of India Act of 1935, which eventually, when it was passed by the British Parliament, gave provincial governance to elected Indian parties, elected on the basis of communal electorates that were divided on the basis of religion. This was a pattern that Britain had designed for India way back in 1906. And in a sense, as one British historian has put it, this succeeded beyond all measure in the sense of dividing India into religious communities. And Churchill, of course, rejoiced on this. At the start of the Second World War, he said that the division between the Hindus and Muslims of India is the bulwark on which British rule in India is built. So he exploited these tensions, these fanned hostilities. Now, mind you, if I go back a little, in 1921, there were 2 major events. The Prince of Wales visited India, that is the man who became King George V. And Gandhi launched the first Satyagraha movement against Britain. And that was the last occasion on which Hindus, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League joined together on one united platform. That was the last time they worked together. Churchill failed in his project to derail the Government of India Act of 1935. And in the process, he antagonized people in his own party because his party was supporting that particular act, although it was in the opposition. The third phase in Churchill's India connection, of course, is between February 1940 and 1947, when British India was divided into two separate entities, India and Pakistan. And Churchill did everything he could, both as Prime Minister between February 1940 and July 1945, and then as leader of the opposition, to block, to overturn, and to sabotage that entire project. Now, the tragedy is that independence in India was something that was inevitable in the sense of the movement that had gained momentum across the country, which could not be turned back, and Britain's own gradual impoverishment as a result of both the First World War and the Second World War, and the fact that Britain could no longer rule that entity that was called British India. There was a period of 2.5 years when the leaders of the Indian independence movements were locked away, put in prison, all of them, in solitary confinement, so to speak, so they could not even meet with one another or communicate with one another between August 1942 and the middle of 1945. And those were the wasted years. Those were the years when Churchill and the British government could have prepared for the eventual partition of India, because partition had become almost an inevitable outcome of the policy of divide and rule that Britain had so brilliantly practiced across India. This led to the carnage, to the killings of partition, which Churchill had foreseen. But Churchill did nothing at all to prepare for partition. He, in fact, those were the wasted years, as I call it. You could call it also a form of governance by inaction or neglect. It's a complicated story in parts, but it's also a fairly straightforward story. And that is the narrative that I present. Now, I realize, Andre, that in so graciously hosting me to this event, you have mobilized your students and your class. And I feel that I owe a particular debt to you and to them in particular to talk about those aspects of India's development of the British-India relationship, the relationship between India, independent India, or what became independent India and Pakistan, and Britain from an international relations perspective. And I want to begin by saying that the most important element in that was that for any country, its march to independence, to self-governance, is really probably the most important act for that country in its future, in its new future as an independent autonomous entity. So the story of India and of Pakistan is interesting from that perspective. But there are also other actors that come into play. And I want to mention in particular the role played by President Roosevelt between 1940, when Churchill became Prime Minister, and April 1945, when President Roosevelt died. During that period of 5 years, the two leaders exchanged over 2,000 communications between them. And it was an extraordinary manner of dialogue between international leaders in the midst of the war, in the most difficult moments of the war, when a range of issues were discussed by them, including Roosevelt's insistence with Churchill that Britain should give self-governance to India, and Churchill's adamant opposition to that. That correspondence, as I said, it consists of over 2,000 communications sent directly by each other, one to the other, mostly without copies being sent to either of the foreign ministries or even the ambassadors. And Roosevelt resorted to another extraordinary device, in that he sent a personal representative to Britain in January 1942 with a letter that he addressed to King George VI, who was the monarch of Britain, saying that I am sending my trusted colleague, Mr. Hopkins, who will represent me in Britain. So in effect, he was creating a super ambassador in Britain. And Hopkins was with Churchill at extraordinary moments, almost on a daily basis, for weeks on end, when he visited Britain. And of course, he went back to the United States in between, but he was very much present in Britain during the crucial times of early 42, when Japan had entered the war. Pearl Harbor had taken place. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, and this was a period of great tension because Japan was on the rampage throughout Southeast Asia. It had sunk 2 major British battleships, and the story of that set of direct conversations between the two leaders. And mind you, they met in person 9 times during those 5 years. How the relationship evolved between them. Initially, Churchill was virtually begged Roosevelt for assistance at a time when it seemed that Britain could not survive the German onslaught, and survive it did, thanks to Churchill. And Churchill provided great leadership, not only to Britain, but to much of what we would call the free world in the language of those days. And these were great achievements, and nothing can be taken away from that. But this was also the time when Churchill, in a sense, blocked all of attempts by Roosevelt to push him and Britain towards giving autonomy, self-governance to India. And that in itself is a fascinating story. There are also other major events that take place, some of which have not been properly studied or researched. The Bengal Famine of 1942-43, in which 3 million people in Bengal died. And this event hardly created a stir, either for Churchill personally or for anyone else in Britain, really, to speak very honestly, to speak very plainly. Now, it is said that Churchill was not responsible for the famine. Of course, he was not. He didn't cause the famine, but he did nothing to deal with it, and he did nothing to provide assistance at a time when it could have been given. That again is a complicated story. Books have been written on this subject. There is lots of controversy over this, but how could Winston Churchill, who was the master of action, the master of intervening directly with frontline actors whenever he felt that something needed to be done. He did nothing to push, to exhort, to guide the Viceroy in India and his government to deal effectively with the Bengal famine. Because the Bengal famine really was a problem of distribution of food. As Amartya Sen, the Nobel Economics Laureate, has said, it was an act of misgovernance by Britain. It was an act, and Churchill was at the top of the pyramid of governance of Britain, and of course British India fell within his realm of responsibilities. So these are also subjects that need deeper examination. Having said this, let me end by saying that a study like this is not definitive, in the sense that we are trying to pierce through the veil of scattered documents, of missing information, and we need to assemble a whole series of different clues, bits of evidence, bits of information that are scattered in different places to work out the sequence of what happened and at what time and under whose responsibility. What I have offered is one holistic study of this very important connection, although, mind you, India was not at the center of Churchill's responsibilities. He had many, many major responsibilities, but he could not shrug away a responsibility of the death of 3 million that occurred while he was the presiding entity, the head of the government, whose responsibilities included the governance of British India. I will stop there. I think it would be better if you and I first engage in a conversation. You have read the book. You have questions in your mind for sure. I'd be happy to respond to some of these, and then we can open it up for a wider discussion. I hope that is agreeable. Thank you very much once again, Andre. Thanks to you. Thanks to all my friends who have joined this Zoom session. And of course, above all, to your students and to your university for hosting me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting. I do have a few questions concerning the book itself and the research of the book, and then a couple more questions, more general, having in view also the module in which this event is taking place. And I'll try not to monopolize the discussion, but indeed several questions came up while reading the book. I mean, the first question that I have is an obvious one, right? Which is what was your motivation behind writing this particular book, and especially the focus on Churchill and Churchill's relation with India. So what was it that attracted you to invest? I mean, Churchill is someone who so much has been written about, right? And what attracted you to try to contribute something extra to that discussion on this historical figure?
As I mentioned right at the beginning, the motivation was that I'm not a historian. I read economics at university, but of course, dealing with international affairs, history is very much part of the material that one reads along with other subjects. I was interested in this because it seemed that this was such an obvious subject that needed examination and study, and that this had not been done. There are bits and pieces of material, information, insights that I have found which have not been tackled by mainstream historians. So I will leave it to others to judge whether the book I've written has elements of originality, whether it adds anything to the information we already have available. But I felt that there were items of information, of data that had not been connected together. I'll give you one little example. The Nobel laureate Pearl Buck was a personal friend of the Roosevelt family, of Eleanor and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Pearl Buck was also a personal friend of Jawaharlal Nehru. And when Nehru was in prison, she kept him supplied with books, partly to guide him towards a better understanding of America. Because Nehru, in a sense, approached international affairs from a leftist perspective. Way back in 1927, he had attended the Congress Against Colonialism and Imperialism, which was held in Brussels. And to an extent, that was a symbol of the way he looked at the Western world. And it was several contemporaries of Nehru's, Americans, who tried to guide him to an understanding that American policy could not simply be seen from the perspective that it was indirectly an imperialist power, that there was much more to America than what he thought. And Pearl Buck tried to guide him along those lines. Now, these were kind of hidden connections that nobody has paid attention to. And Pearl Buck influenced Roosevelt greatly, because way back in 2-3 weeks after the Pearl Harbor events of December 1941, she wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt and to Franklin Delano Roosevelt that a kind of solidarity is emerging among the colored people of the world. And it was this, in a sense, guided Roosevelt towards a stronger determination to push Churchill into giving self-governance to India. Remember, in those days, India was the first country to which a major colonial power was in the process or had started the process of moving towards some kind of self-governance. So what happened in India also affected greatly the national movements and the independence movements of Africa, of other parts of Asia, and the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that connection with Roosevelt and the change in his views on India is very interesting, and the way it is captured in the book. And I have a question about that in a moment. But before that, I wanted to just discuss another point that you mentioned about Churchill, right? Because at a certain point you say that Churchill was adamantly against any type of self-rule or any type of greater autonomy on the part of India. And this is something that can, of course, it has to do with his understanding of India as the crown jewel of the empire. But would you say that his motivations in being, because at a certain point in the book, you actually mentioned that it goes beyond this. And so you actually use the expression that Churchill expressed the hate of all things that he classified as Hindu, right? And so I was wondering why do you think that Churchill was so adamantly opposed to any type of greater autonomy on the part of India? Was it purely a geopolitical stance, or was it something deeper about his worldview and the way that he perceived India and its role?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. Many believe that Churchill was the last Victorian in Britain. He was profoundly influenced by his father's ideas. And his father had, his father had made a 7-month journey to India in 1884, 85, 86, actually. Spent 7 months in India, which was incidentally the custom in those days, because these were vast distances. And when travelers went to a faraway country, they actually spent a lot of time there. When he returned, he gave a speech, I think it was in 86 or middle of 85, where he described India as a vast sea of conflict, tensions, and hidden passions, and that British rule was like a sheet of oil that covered this vast heaving sea, and it brought order and effective governance, although he didn't use that word, to that area. Now, this was wrong on several counts. Firstly, in physics, a sheet of oil only suppresses the movement of the ocean. It does nothing to solve the upheavals that are taking place underwater. But the much deeper problem is that the element of causality was not understood by either Lord Randolph or by Churchill. They saw India as a fallen people, as a people who were making a mess of their lives, which was true. But that was a direct product of colonialism. It was a product of the war that Europe brought to India through its efforts at colonial conquest of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So, India was never a Westphalian state, but India was always a great civilizational state. India was a country never under one single ruler, and yet there was a sense of Indianness. India was united by culture. It was united by a sense of belonging together in spite of multiple languages, different religions, different ways of living. There was an inherent sense of unity, of togetherness to India. And there were great periods of creativity in language, in literature, in science, in the arts, in expression of all manner of human genius, which is part of the civilization of India. Churchill didn't understand this. He saw nothing of this. He simply saw fallen people who were colonized by a number of European powers and eventually under British rule. So that was part of it. And Churchill failed to understand that the march of history made it inevitable that there would be self-governance, and either you worked with it and guided that process to your advantage, or you fell by the wayside. And that was the tragedy of Churchill, that he failed to understand that there was an inexorable march of history that was underway, and that Britain was itself a power that was in decline, thanks to World War I, and even more so thanks to World War II. But it's a complicated story. There are no easy answers.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And just picking up on something that you mentioned, right? You talked about this notion of civilization, and in the book itself, you mentioned how the British Empire and even Churchill's understanding of the British Empire frequently saw the British Empire as involved in a civilizing mission. So in many ways, the colonial practice was frequently legitimized as a civilizing mission, as taking civilization to the places where there was none, right? And interestingly, one of the theoretical schools that we study in this international relations theory module is the English school, which talks about a lot the notion of civilization, and especially how European empires used the notion of civilization and the standard of civilization as a way to legitimize colonial rule, right? And while reading the book, I was wondering whether, in your view, how this type of standard of civilization, which informed also Churchill's view of the British Empire's relations with India,
yes,
framed not only those relations, but to what extent do you feel it still conditions contemporary world politics, and mainly India's place in contemporary world politics?
The notion that Europeans, Western powers, brought civilization and culture to other parts of the world, whether in Latin America, in Africa, or in Asia is a persistent, self-created myth that has survived in a certain way even till today, as you rightly point out. These were great cultures. These were great civilizations of great achievement, whether the Incas and all the different empires that ruled over Latin America, the tribal kingdoms of Africa. Now, Western powers saw them, of course, as arrayed against each other, and they did fight. They did have lots and lots of conflict, but they also had great periods of mutual tranquility, of creativity. That is not understood and that is not accepted. So, it's very interesting that the European powers that came to India in the 17th and 18th century saw that this was a culture that had great achievements to its credit. But as more and more Europeans came, particularly the British, after they dislodged the French at the Battle of Plassey in 1758, I believe, or 59, and established British rule over much of India, there was a sense that Britain was bringing civilization and culture and refinement to India. The past was easily forgotten. There are many examples that can be given, but one that strikes me particularly is that the British liberals, you would expect liberals to imagine, to be able to understand other cultures and other ways of life. But this notion for India was rejected with the simple thesis, the simple argument that India had no culture. And because it had no culture, it was Britain's task to bring culture and civilization to India. And that message, that line of argument, that mission civilisatrice argument, sadly, is the myth on which all the colonial empires were based. And that's part of the tragedy. And you're right in saying that some of this continues even till today. And there is this notion that the global set of values, the universal values, are essentially the values of the West. I have a very simple question. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was framed in 1948, when so many rights were incorporated into that declaration, how is it that nobody put into that a right to a decent life, a right to a standard of living that was a human standard of living? How come the economic right was never included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? I would be delighted if somebody could guide me and tell me why that right was also not a universal right to which all people are entitled. And much of what we see today, including the huge surge of migration in search of better lives, is indirectly a product of that quest for better living standards, which have been denied to so many developing countries for so many decades.
Thank you very much. That's a very good discussion, and it's interesting because we've had a similar discussion throughout the semester, exactly when we were talking about the universality of human rights and so on. So that's a very good point, and it actually connects with another question that I had, which is because nowadays we talk a lot, and in our classes we've been talking a lot about this notion of the rise of the global south, whatever. I mean, in a very simplistic manner, and the possibility of a transition to a multipolar world, which is not as Western centered as before. Two questions in that regard. So do you think that the rise, so to speak, of countries in the so-called global south could have a role in potentially expanding understandings of human rights along the lines of that you are mentioning? And the second sub-question of that is, how do you see India's role in that rise of the global south? Because as the largest democracy in the world, right, and a country with such a long history and such a long heritage, how do you see India's role in the world today? Because usually people, especially in international relations here, sometimes we end up talking a lot about China and China's rise and so on, and not so much about India. And so I was wondering, what were your views on that?
That's a very difficult question to which one might frame a response. I think our challenge has been to move our own economic development along paths, along avenues that bring the best level of welfare to our own people. India's economic reforms began in 1991, some 12, 13 years after China's. And in those past, 29 years, major changes have taken place in India, but it is still not enough. We have still a long way to go. And I don't think India is a designated leader of any group of countries, but we have ideas, and we believe that we are moving one way or another towards a multipolar world in which different states, different communities, different sets of ideas will compete against one another. We are a democracy, but we have many problems as a democracy, and we wouldn't call ourselves remotely a perfect democracy. But as we have seen so recently in other countries, there has to be a way in which people are able to run their own countries. They have a right to run their own countries, and everywhere the challenge is the same: how to provide a form of government that brings order, brings development, brings growth and latitude to people to grow themselves into the best human beings that they can be. This is a universal challenge to which no country has a formula that is a magic formula, and we're all groping for answers. But these are truisms. I don't say anything remotely original in saying this. And this gets us very far away from the subject of our conversation today as well. But you are right in raising this question, because ultimately it all boils down to what do we do for our own people, both as countries and as a universal global civilization, global collection of civilizations.
Thank you very much. And I just have a couple of more questions. I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but going back to the book, exactly as you mentioned, I was very curious because at a certain point, and even in your presentation today, you mentioned this, right? How Churchill's relation with Roosevelt was very important, also in shaping Roosevelt's view of a post-Second World War world order, right? And at a certain point in the book, you mentioned that Churchill was also very influential in the context of the Atlantic Charter in trying to exclude a more prominent role for India in the formation of the UN also. And I was wondering exactly what how do you see that influence, and what were the effects of it? Would you say that were it not for this influence on Churchill's part to reduce the role, a potential role for India in the United Nations, is there any possibility that India could have a larger role at the UN, and what that would mean?
No, Andre, we don't know that. We don't know that. But what we do know is that the Atlantic Charter of August 1941, it was a product of that very first face-to-face meeting between Winston Churchill and Roosevelt in the ocean, off the shores of Canada, in hazardous times, when each leader traveling to their meeting had to face the possibility of U-boat attacks and all manner of wartime hazards. The Atlantic Charter was never really originally designed as a document that would be so enormously important in the years to come. It was simply a declaration, and therefore it was negotiated by the two sides using the language that had been used by the two leaders. And you're right, although the Charter speaks repeatedly of all countries, all peoples, and their universal rights, Churchill gave it a narrow interpretation, and he said this only applies to the people of Europe and does not apply to the colonized people. This was really at the heart of Churchill's worldview. He thought of good governance and order and values as applicable essentially to the white race. He was a racist, out and out. There is no question about it. And Roosevelt did his best to push him in the direction that all people have the same rights, regardless of where they live or their color or their race. And Churchill simply could not buy into that argument. And that is at the core of so many issues that came up. Now, would things have been different if the Atlantic Charter had, if Churchill had not opposed the universality of the Atlantic Charter? Would things have been different in the formation of the United Nations? We just don't know. There is no basis on which we can come to any conclusion. But in my mind, it is clear that the injustices that India suffered in the formation of the United Nations go back to the Atlantic Charter. Might it have been different? I don't know. We are trying then to guess at something over which really there is no concrete way of coming to any kind of a clear conclusion. And there are friends in India who tell me that I'm barking up the wrong tree if I blame the Atlantic Charter for the position to which India was left at the United Nations. But I think there is a connection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just have one last question, not to monopolize the discussion, and then we open the floor to further questions. And this, as we've talked when organizing this session, so the majority of our students here are international relations students, and many of them see the possibility of working at a foreign office or something along those lines as a future career possibility. And I was wondering, with your very long and important experience working in foreign affairs as a diplomat, as an ambassador, what do you think are, I mean, very simply, what would you highlight as some of the main characteristics that a good diplomat should have nowadays in a period of so many changes in the world?
Andre, that's again a very, very big question. You know, in different parts of the world, the study of international affairs has been evolving in the past 20 years or so. And in the United States, and even in Britain, and certainly in China, and in India now, the practice of diplomacy is entering the field of international studies as a sub-subject, as a subsidiary area of examination, study, and research within the broad rubric of international affairs. You know very well that in the United States, there are at least 20, maybe many more, professorships that use the word diplomatic practice, practice of diplomacy, a professor of practice in international studies. China has for many years combined the study of the practice of universities, have appointed professors of diplomatic practice. So there is a move afoot in many parts of the world. Practice of diplomacy is not studied as it ought to be. I've had the privilege of lecturing for 8 years, offering a 6-lecture module at the Vienna School of International Studies of International Affairs. And I know that my course, which was an elective course, drew a good amount of attention. In fact, in 1 year, it had an amazing response from the student community, who some 50 of them, more than 50, joined my class. And the next year, the number was down to 10. I mean, see, part of the problem is that the people who decide on the curriculum, who decide on the areas of study, are people who have spent a lifetime in the study of theory and who have no exposure or experience of the practice of diplomacy. But how can we study international affairs if we do not look at practice? You know, I gave, right in the beginning, I gave the example of the Roosevelt-Churchill correspondence. I really do believe that that correspondence is a remarkable treasure trove for a PhD thesis, for example, from a European perspective, perhaps, from a British perspective, or an American perspective, in terms of how statesmen conduct themselves in their relationships. I'll give you an example. Winston Churchill devised a splendid formula when Harry Hopkins was at his side in London. You know, Harry Hopkins literally spent night after night in the war rooms in London, where these were the shelters, the deep underground shelters in which the British Prime Minister retreated every day, literally, because of the heavy bombing that was carried out in 41 and 42 by German aircraft. When he received a letter from Churchill, from Roosevelt, with which he disagreed enormously, and many of these letters related to India and self-governance for India, he would immediately dictate a very, very sharp response. And then he would not send that. So that became a draft not sent. But it entered the folio. It entered the files as a draft not sent. And of course, Harry Hopkins was given a copy. So in a sense, it became an instance where one leader could express himself very bluntly to the other leader without saying it officially, by simply saying, this is a draft that was not sent. In one of those drafts, which was in response to a letter that, a message, not letter, a message that Roosevelt sent to Churchill on the 11th of May, 1942, Churchill actually threatened to resign. He told him that if you push me so hard on the issue of self-governance for India, I shall resign as Prime Minister. Now, it's an extraordinary threat. It's, I mean, what is the meaning of making such a threat to another leader? Simply to say that, don't push me, that I cannot be pushed beyond a point. And of course, he had no intention of resigning at all. I mention this because this is the practice of diplomacy. Now, it doesn't figure anywhere in the theoretical structures, but that's not important. By all means, study theory. The theory will give you a set of guidelines with which you can analyze the real world. That's splendid. But you cannot treat theory as a replacement for the real world. This is why I come back to the point that, say we talk about trade negotiations today. You have to study what goes on at WTO. You have to study what happens in the major global trade agreements and the impact that they produce. Now, that is the real world. You can't simply look at it from a theoretical perspective. And that theory may guide you, or it may be that practice is going to give new insights in terms of theory. So, you know, Andre, it is a very strange situation that international affairs is one of those few subjects in which there still exists this large hiatus, this large gulf between theory and practice. Practice will affect theory, and theory does influence practice. But in the world of practice, really, one has to really go by what happens in the real world and study that and examine that, and then come to conclusions rather than the other way around.
Thank you very much for that, and that's a very good note to end on, because as an IR theory lecturer, that is something that I always emphasize with my students as well, the fundamental importance of always connecting theory with reality and having a deep understanding of history as well, which is something that should not ever be lost sight of. Well, thank you very much. That was wonderful, and thank you very much for your kind answers and insights.